Welcome to Late Night Tea with Dr. G. Let's see what it says tonight. The creation of 1,000 forests is in one acorn. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Mm. All right, go get yourself a hot cup of tea and your FARA. Because tonight we're going to go over airspace. We're going to start in 14 CFR Part 71. And that's a really small section and then we'll go to Chapter 3 of the AIM. So first of all, what is airspace? Airspace, it's basically invisible dimensions that goes from the Earth's surface, the airport environment, up at a certain altitude. Different types of airspace have different requirements. They go to different altitudes, and then they also have different airplane requirements and sometimes pilot requirements. So we're going to go through all of those. So first, let's go to 14 CFR, Part 71. And you can see that the title says, or the subject area is designation of class Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and Echo airspace areas, air traffic service routes, and reporting points. So basically, part 71 covers airspace. Now, I'd like to start with 71.7, and it says that all bearings and radials in this part are true. Highlight the word true, and are applied from point of origin, and all mileages in this part are stated as nautical miles. Highlight nautical miles. So anytime we look at an aeronautical chart or a sectional, all those bearings and radials are going to be true north as opposed to magnetic north. And then any distance that is posted, the mileages are going to be in nautical miles. And the other part from part 71, let's look at 71.9, which talks about overlapping airspace designations. So sometimes you look at an aeronautical chart or a sectional, and there's an area that has two different overlapping airspaces. And just like basically any regulation, you always want to go more restrictive, like more, always go the safer route. So the overlapping space, the more restrictive airspace applies. And from our airspaces, Class A is the most restrictive, and it gets less restrictive as you go through the alphabet. So under Part A, it says when overlapping airspace designations apply to the same airspace, the operating rules associated with the more restrictive airspace designation applies. And then it goes on to say, for example, B1, Class A airspace is more restrictive than, and it lists everything, B, C, D, E, or G. And then Class B, and then C, then D, and then E. And then G is the last. It's not restrictive, it's uncontrolled. So we're going to talk about controlled airspace, uncontrolled airspace, special use airspace, and then other. Okay, so let's go to our AIM now. Let's go to our Aeronautical Information Manual. So it's the last half of your book, Chapter 3. And this whole section talks about airspace. And it's easier to follow because it's in the AIM. So let's look at Chapter 3-1-1, paragraph Alpha 1 and 2, as well as Bravo. So first of all, there are two categories of airspace. There's regulatory and non-regulatory. So think of it as like there's two umbrellas here, regulatory, non-regulatory. Regulatory says examples are class A, B, C, D, and E, restricted and prohibited. And then non-regulatory, while there are regulations, think of it as it's not regulated by air traffic control. So this is going to be your MOAs, military operation areas, warning areas, alert areas, CFAs, which are controlled firing areas, and NSA, national security areas. And then after those two categories, within that, there are four types of airspace. There's controlled airspace, which means it's controlled by air traffic control, which means basically you need permission to move in certain areas. Sometimes there's areas that you don't have to have permission, non-movement areas, but you have to have permission to move in controlled airspace. And then we have uncontrolled airspace, special use, and then other. An example of other would be like TFRs that we'll get into. And then if you've ever wondered, like, how do they determine what type of airspace each airport will have, then these are your variables. They're dictated by the complexity of density of aircraft movement. So I'm under paragraph C, 1 through 4. Number 2, the nature of the operations conducted. So like, is it military? Is it civilian? Is it both? Number 3, the level of safety required. And 4, the national and public interest. So all of that just dictates the different types of airspace. Okay. Now let's look at chapter 3-1-4, where it talks about basic VFR weather minimums. Remember, VFR stands for Visual Flight Rules. And A says no person may operate an aircraft under basic VFR when the flight visibility is less or at a distance from clouds that is less than what's prescribed in the corresponding altitude and class of airspace. And then turn the page and under chapter, still under chapter 3, but table 3-1-1, they give you a table that's your basic VFR weather minimums. So what that means is if you look, you've got your airspace in one column. Sometimes they break it up based on altitude. Even down here, they break it up based on whether it's day or night. And then there are 2 columns here. So your basic VFR weather minimums are based on your visibility and your distance from clouds. So if you look at this table and the weather is below this, they're below these minimums, then that means that you cannot fly in visual flight rules. It means you have to fly IFR. And in order to fly instrument flight rules, you have to have a instrument rating. So, for example, Class A, this column says none, and this column says none, which means there are not any VFR weather minimums, which means you cannot fly VFR in Class A. You have to fly IFR. And you look here, Class B says you have to have 3 statute miles and just stay clear of clouds. Class Charlie, 3 statute miles. And then imagine there's a cloud right here. You have to be, your airplane has to be able to be at least 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above the cloud, staying away from it. And then both sides laterally, horizontally, 2,000 feet. Because you have to remember when you're on a VFR flight, you're not supposed to be anywhere near clouds because they can become spatially disoriented, excuse me. And then, worst case scenario would be inadvertent IMC on a VMC flight, which basically means a VFR pilot accidentally gets themselves into a cloud and they get disoriented and then lose stability of the aircraft. So the VFR minimums here are to protect both VFR and IFR pilots. And then Class Echo, you can see Class D, 3 statute miles, same thing, 50 below, 1,000 above, 2,000 lateral. Then you can see Class Echo starts talking about whether you're at or above, or below 10,000 feet MSL. The numbers just change. So what I want you to get from this is there are 2 variables that determine your VFR weather minimums. It's visibility and distance from clouds or cloud clearances. Think of it like that. Now, I like to start with this picture because it gives a nice overview of airspace dimensions. And we're going to start with Class A. So we're going to be looking at this part here. We're going to go through each one of these. And I'm kind of keep referencing this picture. It is in your book, figure 3-2-1. Okay, so Class A, Class Alpha airspace. We are on, let's see. Turn the page and go to chapter 3-2-2. Chapter 3-2-2. Paragraph A, definition. It says generally, that airspace, talking about Class A, from 18,000 feet MSL up to and including flight level 600, which is 60,000 feet, including the airspace overlying the waters within 12 nautical miles off the coast of the 48 contiguous states in Alaska, and designated international airspace beyond 12 nautical miles off the coast of the 48 contiguous states in Alaska, within areas of domestic radio navigational signal or ATC radar coverage and within which domestic procedures are applied. So simplified, Class Alpha starts at 18,000 feet, goes up to flight level 600. Then B says their operating rules and pilot equipment requirements. Unless otherwise authorized, all persons must operate the aircraft under IFR. And remember, we looked at this table and we said, okay, what are the VFR weather minimums for Class A? There are none. So you cannot fly visually at 18,000 feet. Think of it, if you looked outside your aircraft, it's different when you're like low level flying, in a Diamond DA-40. You can look out the airplane in good visibility and see highways and roads and campus and buildings. But at 18,000 feet, you're definitely relying on all your instruments, right? So you're going to want to be instrument rated because you have to file an IFR flight plan. So that's it for Class A. That was pretty straightforward on that. Just know starts at 8. So each airspace, I want you to know the dimensions, and I want you to know any equipment that you have to have working and if there's any pilot certification required. So for this one, Class A starts at 18,000, goes up to flight level 600, have to fly IFR, which means the pilot must have an instrument rating. All right. Next up is Class Bravo. Class Bravo excuse me. Oop. Before we get to Class Bravo, actually, I wanted to show you what this legend looks like. Most all of you are probably looking at these on ForeFlight now on your iPad, but you can still purchase actual paper charts. But whether you're using a tablet or actual paper, this legend is always provided. And I wanted you to see that Class Alpha is not charted. So that just starts at 18,000, goes up to flight level 600. Class Bravo would be blue solid line. Class Charlie is magenta solid. Class Delta is blue dash lines. And Class Echo, you'll see, has 3 options depending on where it begins, whether it's at the surface, whether the base starts at 700 feet above ground level or 1,200 feet. So it would be dash magenta, shaded magenta, blue. Shaded magenta, shaded blue, excuse me. And so looking here at the next slide, we're going to start talking about Class Bravo. If you look at this excerpt here I have from Boston International Airport, you can see it's surrounded by these blue circles. Blue solid line means it's Class B airspace. Looking at this picture, this looks like we have like the nice wedding cake, the bride's cake, the one that's really nice. And you took the cake and you flipped it upside down, and that's what this looks like. It even says it in the book. It says it looks like an upside down wedding cake, where you can see they have the different layers. So let's go. In our book, chapter 3-2-3, Class B airspace. Definition. It says, generally, that airspace from the surface up to 10,000 feet MSL. And it says it surrounds the nation's busiest airports. Highlight the word busiest airports in terms of IFR operations or passenger enplanements. So Class B is busiest. Next sentence says the configuration of each Class B airspace is individually tailored, so they can all be a little different depending on obstacles, clearances, nav reception, etc. It says they're individually tailored and consist of a surface area and 2 or more layers. Some Class B resembles an upside down wedding cake. And it's designed to contain all the published instrument procedures, like the ILS, think of it like that, once an aircraft enters the airspace. Now, this next part is important. Highlight this. It says an ATC clearance is required for all aircraft to operate in the area. And all aircraft that are so cleared receive separation services from air traffic control within that airspace. So I also wanted you to see under paragraph B, it mentions again, you have to have an ATC clearance. So, you would have to specifically request permission to enter their airspace. And not only do you have to hear your tail number, they have to actually give you permission to enter. It says it goes from the surface up to 10,000. So you can see here for Boston, we've got different layers here, right? Where it starts. Boston's right here, right? We've got surface. This one goes up. Well, this one starts at 2,000, tops at 7,000. This starts at 3,000. So all the tops are the same, right? 7,000. This area here starts at 4,000. This area over here, the layer started at 3,000. So it just depends on the surrounding area. So that's the dimensions. What does the airplane have to have? Go to number one under paragraph B1. And it says, unless otherwise authorized by ATC, aircraft must be equipped with highlight operable two-way radio capable of communicating with ATC on appropriate frequencies for that Class B airspace. We have to remember this is the busiest airspace in the world, right? So ATC needs to be able to communicate with you, and you need to be able to communicate with ATC. Now, number two says, think of it as these are like the crazy busiest airports in the nation. Number two says, no person may take off or land a civil aircraft at the following primary airports within Class Bravo airspace unless the pilot in command holds at least a private pilot certificate, which would exclude student pilots from flying into their airspace. And so if you look at the list here, you can see they're very busy airports. Andrews Air Force Base, Atlanta, which is the busiest airport in the world. Boston, which we have on here. Chicago O'Hare, Dallas Fort Worth, Los Angeles, Miami, Newark, New York, both Kennedy and LaGuardia, Ronald Reagan, and San Francisco. So those require private pilot. The next part I want us to look at is for instrument flight rules. They're the requirements for what the airplane has to have working properly. And let's highlight number 5, paragraph A through C. So 5 says, unless otherwise authorized by ATC, each aircraft must be equipped as follows. 5A says for IFR operations, an operable VOR. And VOR, remember, stands for very high frequency omnidirectional range. So that's the ground-based navigation, right? It's on the ground, transmits a signal, aircraft receives it, and the pilot either flies to a VOR or they fly from it, with a VOR sending a signal in 360 degrees. So you have to have one of those working, or you can have the military counterpart, which is a TACAN, or it says an operable and suitable RNAV system, and RNAV is area navigation. Area navigation is the most direct route from point A to point B, where it uses what we call waypoints. And so you would enter those waypoints in your onboard computer system. Usually it's your flight management system, your FMS. And it can be VORs, or they can actually just be latitude, longitude coordinates. And so instead of having to fly around to each VOR, right, you can just put in your departure and your arrival and just fly straight there through area navigation through RNAV. So you got to have one of those. Part B says you also have to have for all operations a two-way radio capable of communications with ATC, again on the appropriate frequencies for that area. C says, unless otherwise authorized by ATC, an operable radar beacon transponder with automatic altitude reporting capability. That's one equipment. And then it says, and operable ADS-B out equipment. So the operable radar beacon transponder looks like an old transistor radio in the cockpit, and it sends a signal out to ATC from your airplane, and on their radar scope, that's what gives them their data block. Like that's how they know where you are, how fast you're going, your altitude, your tail number. Well, and then your altitude actually comes from what we call mode C. So if you look back in your book, it says operable radar beacon transponder with automatic altitude reporting capability. So we call that a transponder with mode C. That would give everything ATC needs to know where you're at so that they can make sure they maintain separation of aircraft in flight, right, within their controlled airspace. And then the other one was ADS-B out, which that equipment is going to send out a signal and let everyone else know where you're at. And it really wasn't, it was just implemented in, I believe it was 2020. A lot of people, obviously, we also have ADS-B in so that you can see where other airplanes are as well. But the federal requirement is to have ADS-B out, so your airplane sends a signal out. If you wanted to know more about that, let's see. Like if you wanted to take a rabbit trail, let's see. Let's go to our index. ADS-B, let's find it. ADS-B out. The index says it's on page 233. Page 233, Part 91, Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast Out. Yes, it was required after January 1st, 2020. So every airplane, GA airplanes, every Cessna, Diamond, Piper, all of them have to have ADS-B out, which is so cool because it definitely has reduced mid-air collisions in general aviation, right? Because we can see where everybody's at now. So what do we need to fly IFR? So let's go through the answers. For IFR operations in Class B, we need a VOR. We need a two-way radio capable of communicating, which means these things have to work, right? Operable VOR, a radio. We need the transponder with mode C, and we need ADS-B out. That's required for Class Bravo. We also need a clearance. That's not equipment requirement, but just operational requirement. That was Class B. So how... And we know it's Class Bravo again by looking at the air sectional chart and seeing the solid blue line. All right. So let's go to Class C airspace now. And the example I gave you on here is San Jose International Airport. And you can see the runways are here, and it's surrounded by the solid magenta line. You can see SFC starts for surface, and then it gives you the top and some different numbers here based on different terrain or obstacles. But if you look at, basically it looks like you took like a top hat and flipped this one upside down. So we only have one shelf on this one. Okay, so let's go in our FAR book, in our AIM, let's go to the next page, chapter 3-2-4. Paragraph A, Class C says, generally, this airspace starts at the surface to 4,000 feet above the airport elevation, so it's charted in MSL. And it surrounds those airports that have an operational control tower, are serviced by a radar approach control, and have a certain number of IFR operations or passenger enplanements. So they're still busy, but they're not as busy as Class Bravo, right? If you look then down a little bit, it says that it usually consists of a 5 nautical mile radius core that extends from the surface up to 4,000 feet, and a 10 nautical mile radius shelf that extends no lower than 1,200 up to 4,000. So basically, here's your airport, right? The cylinder part here is 5 nautical mile radius, and then it doubles on the top shelf there, 10 nautical mile radius. All right, so what do we have to fly in Class C? Remember, as we go through these letters, they become less restrictive. So it will not be as much as you need for Class B airspace. Go to paragraph Charlie 1, and it says no specific pilot certification. Number 2, for equipment, you still have to have that two-way radio capable of communication. And part B says operable radar beacon transponder with automatic altitude reporting capability. So again, to simplify that, we just say transponder with mode C. And then still, everyone has to have the ADS-B out equipment. So what was eliminated from Class C was the operable VOR or TACAN or RNAV. Is less restrictive for that. And then if you look under number 3 and look at the different notes, it has the different ways that you can establish communication. The communications required are different than Class Bravo, where in Class Charlie, as long as you hear the controller say your tail number, you have established communication and you are allowed to enter their airspace. Where Class B you actually have to be given permission to enter. Something I thought you might find interesting is Nashville is the first and only airspace system or airport that has been designated a special designation that's not even in the FARs yet, and it's called Super Charlie Airspace, where basically two in to improve safety and reduce the risk of mid-air collisions, because there is a lot of air traffic in Nashville, but they do not qualify or have all the requirements to change it to Class Bravo. So they basically extended it out from 10 to 15 nautical miles in August of 2023 and raised it up to 6,000 feet. And this is like I wrote here, this is a unique configuration. This is not anywhere else in the world, in the U.S. This is U.S. airspace. And I wanted to show you this link from the FAA website for Nashville, just in case anyone's interested in going back and reading. I thought it was really interesting where you can click BNA cautions, and they give you different hot spots and like why these have been, possible issues in the past. Like taxiway Kilo is in the approach area for runway 20 center. Pilots have failed to hold short when instructed, even after reading back the correct hold short instructions. So they're telling you that. They're telling you to be vigilant for this other hot spot. And this is because the taxiway is right beside runway 20 center. And they're very similar, if not almost exactly the same in width. So these are just different issues to look out for. Movement area cautions, and even a video. So if you're interested, just go back and look at faa.gov.bna. So looking here at Nashville, you can see there's 3 parallel runways, one intersecting, and it starts at the surface, goes up to 6,000. This area jumps up to 1,800 feet, 2,400 feet over here, 1,800 feet, 1,800 feet, 2,400 feet. But again, of course, the tops are all at 6,000. So Nashville, Super Charlie Airspace. They're really busy. That's basically what they were saying. So they extended it out a little more, went into John Tune, and you can see Smyrna right here as well. But they've always covered that. But they extended it out a little bit more and they raised it up. All right. Class Delta. So let's go to chapter 3-2-5. Class D looks just like this one cylinder here. So again, we're getting less restrictive as we go through, right? This one says generally it starts from the surface and goes up to 2,500 feet. And it's this is Smyrna right here, which is Kilo Mike Quebec Yankee Airport, and it's got blue dash lines around it. And that's how you know it's Class Delta airspace. It says it surrounds airports that have an operational control tower. So Smyrna is not open 24/7. And so it's only Class Delta when the control tower is operational. It says the configuration of each Class D airspace area is individually tailored. And when instrument procedures are published, the airspace will normally be designed to contain those procedures. Number 1 says Class D service areas may be designated as full-time or part-time. Part-time Class D effective times are published in the chart supplement. Chart supplements are what used to be called AFDs, if that sounds more familiar, airport facility directories. There were those like mint colored books, but now they're called chart supplements, and you can pull them up on ForeFlight or on the FAA website. And then number 2 talks more about if it's part-time, like what it would go to, whether it goes to Class E or Class G. Okay, B1 says no pilot certification. Number 2, all you have to have is operable two-way radio. So we're getting less restrictive. And then they talk about, establishing communications there. Some notes that are really useful to read. Again, there is more in each section. I'm just covering the highlight parts of the dimensions, what the pilot has to have, what the airplane has to have working in order to get in that airspace. All right, Class E airspace. Think of it like this. Everywhere else that is controlled. Because remember, we've talked about A, B, C, D airspace. That's all controlled. You have to have permission from air traffic control, right? Everywhere else that's controlled, that's not designated A, B, C, or D, is Class Echo. And think of it, it's because once you take off, right, out of an airport and you have air traffic control assisting you, once you're en route, you still are going to want air traffic control maintaining separation. So you're going to be handed off to different controllers en route, different frequencies, and that's going to be your Class E airspace throughout the US. You can see here that sometimes, depending on how it's charted, Class Echo can start at the surface. Sometimes it starts at 700 feet and sometimes it starts at 1,200 feet. So going back here, like if we look, let's see, if we look at this picture, this is all the green is Class E, right? So this is showing that, okay, sometimes it starts at the surface. Sometimes Class E starts at 700 AGL. Sometimes it starts at 1,200 feet AGL. And you would know that again by looking at the chart and seeing how it is depicted. If it's not designated one of these controlled airspaces, then the other option is Class G, which is uncontrolled airspace. Think of it as you have to, the silly way to remember it is you have to have guts to fly in Class G. You don't have to talk to anybody. No one has to talk to you. There's no requirements for that. Now, in our flight school, we have a lot of pilots flying and we have protocols in place for our program. But the airport itself does not have requirements to communicate. There is no air traffic control tower, right? It's uncontrolled airspace. And okay, so that's it for controlled and uncontrolled airspace. Now let's talk about special use airspace, which is in chapter 3-4-1. And I kind of want to go through each section and just look at a sentence or two and highlight them as we go along. Well, you can see up here, we've got this legend showing us what prohibited, restricted, warning, alert areas would look like, MOAs would look like, special airport traffic areas. This is an example of restricted airspace. We know because we see the word restricted. We also have these different quadrants that have the letter R. These numbers and letters would correspond with the legend in the sectional that would tell you information about that specific section. And this is a Bishop MOA, military operation area, and this is an example of prohibited. So I just want to go through the definitions with you real quick. Of course, it's pilot's responsibility to know where these airspace dimensions are and not to fly through them, or to ensure you get the proper permission ahead of time. So let's go to prohibited areas, chapter 3-4-2. Prohibited areas contain airspace of defined dimensions identified by an area of the, on the surface of the earth within which the flight of aircraft is, highlight the word prohibited. Prohibited. You have to have permission to fly and prohibited. Think of that. They both start with the letter P. So there are not times or dates where you could. It is always prohibited. You can never fly through prohibited airspace without permission from the controlling agency. So remember that. Next sentence says such areas are established for security or other reasons associated with the national welfare. So that would be a big, big, big no-no to fly through prohibited airspace without permission. Restricted airspace is a step below that. So under paragraph chapter 3-4-3, part A says restricted airspace contains restricted areas contain airspace identified by an area on the surface of the earth within which the flight of an aircraft, while not wholly prohibited, is subject to restrictions. Because if it was wholly prohibited, it would be called prohibited airspace. So restricted is like sometimes you're not allowed. Like maybe it says on the legend, Monday through Friday from 9 to 5, don't fly from surface to 10,000 feet without permission. Outside of that, you can fly without permission. So it's a little less restrictive. All right, warning areas. Next one, chapter 3-4-4. A warning area is an airspace of defined dimensions extending from 3 nautical miles. That's the key number, 3. Outward of the U.S., coast of the U.S., that contains activity that may be hazardous to non-participating aircraft. So if you're not part of the operation, they're saying you probably don't need to be in there. The way I remember that is if you take the letter W like this, it looks like the number three. So just remember, a warning area is within 3 nautical miles off the coast, and you're not supposed to fly through it unless you're part of the exercise or the activity. Otherwise, could have potential danger. All right, let's talk about MOAs, military operation areas. I mean, you can look at the words itself and define it. Military operations area is an area where military operate. So you shouldn't be there unless you're in the military. So A says MOAs consists of airspace of defined vertical and lateral limits established for the purpose of separating certain military training activities from IFR traffic. That's it. That's straightforward on that one. Next one is alert areas. Alert area says chapter 3-4-6 says they're depicted on aeronautical charts to inform non-participating pilots of areas that may contain a high volume of pilot training or an unusual type of aerial activity. So think of like MTSU, we have a large flight school. That's a high volume of pilot training. We're not actually in an alert area, so that was not the best example, but I just was thinking of any type of unusual aerial activity. Maybe there's a lot of gliders in the area or balloons, something like that, right? Or blimps, and they'll usually say this is an alert area. Next is chapter 3-4-7, controlled firing areas. So highlight that. That's just like it sounds, CFAs. It says they have, again, would be hazardous non-participating aircraft. So they have to have someone on the ground that's called a spotter, and they literally look up, and if they see an aircraft, they have to stop operations because they're shooting in weapons into the sky. So low-flying aircraft could be a hazard. And then we have chapter 3-4-8, national security areas. Again, these are starting to be really self-explanatory. Consists of airspace of defined vertical and lateral dimensions established at locations where there is a requirement for increased security and safety of ground facilities. And then I want to focus on TFRs for just a little bit. These are called temporary flight restrictions, TFRs. So I'm in the other section, section 5, and let's go to chapter 3-5-3, paragraph B. And I would like for you to just look through number 1-6. These are all the different reasons why we might have TFRs. Think of it as anytime there's a lot of people on the ground, they don't want people flying low in case something happens, there's an emergency. So I have number 1, protect persons and property in the air or on the surface from an existing or imminent hazard associated with an incident on the surface when the presence of low-flying aircraft would magnify, alter, spread, or compound that hazard. So sometimes there was sometimes when there are riots, maybe they will put a TFR over there just in case there's any gunfire at low altitude, right? That could cause damage to an aircraft on final approach. Typically, is what happens. I've seen that happen. Otherwise, it's typically we're trying to protect people on the ground. Number 2 says safe environment for the operation of disaster relief aircraft. Number 3, prevent an unsafe congestion of sightseeing for an incident or event which could generate high degree of public interest. So I have on here like Bonnaroo Music Festival, sporting events, campus events have TFRs. The political conventions have temporary flight restrictions. Sometimes conferences do if they're really large. So anywhere where there's a lot of people involved. And then, of course, number 4 says national disasters for humanitarian reasons in the state of Hawaii. And then for what I was saying, of course, is for number 5, protect the president and vice president. And it's sometimes public figures. One example, a few years ago, the Pope came to Chicago and they had a TFR. And number six says provide a safe environment for space agency operations. So NASA launches, SpaceX launches, things of that nature. These are all different reasons. Also, Disney World and Disneyland have temporary flight restrictions. And any former United States president's home, like the George Bush home in Texas, has TFRs over them. You can find them again in ForeFlight, or you can go to the FAA website. And let's just see some today. So Ohio has one for VIP movement. This one, if we click in Wyoming, this is for provide a safe environment for firefighting. And they'll give you, radius, altitude, all the information here. Hazards, VIP, let's see what else. Security, hazards. There you go. Air shows are on there. There's a lot of hazards and security on this today. Yeah, there you go. And there's the former President Bush house I was talking about. And Disneyland, Disney World, which is these are not really temporary. They're actually always in place. They've been in place since 2014. But you can still get permission to fly through a temporary flight restriction. You just like anything else, you have to get permission ahead of time. Otherwise, you're not allowed to fly through them. And that's a wrap on airspace. Thank you for joining me. I hope you had a nice cup of tea. I hope you have a wonderful night and chat with you later.